Welcome to Bedtime Express, where history meets tranquility and stories carry you gently into peaceful sleep. I'm your narrator for tonight's journey, and I'm delighted you've chosen to spend these quiet hours with us. Tonight, we're traveling back to a divided Berlin, where love bloomed between concrete barriers and hope flourished despite impossible odds. You'll hear the story of Wilhelm and Elena, two hearts separated by the Berlin Wall for 25 years, whose patient love letters became a testament to the power of human connection. Their tale weaves together one of history's most dramatic political events with an intimate romance that proves walls can divide cities, but never truly separate souls. This is a story of letters written in secret, of faith sustained across decades, and of the magical night in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and two lovers finally found each other in celebrating crowds. Its history told through the lens of the heart, perfect for gentle listening as you drift toward dreams. Before you fall asleep, please give us a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more historical bedtime stories that soothe the soul. Your support helps us continue creating these peaceful journeys through time. Now, settle into your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your breathing slow and deepen. Allow the gentle rhythm of this tale to carry you toward restful sleep. Our story begins in 1961, in a city about to be divided, where two young souls are living parallel lives, unaware that fate is already weaving invisible threads between their hearts. Sweet dreams, dear listeners. Let love guide you into peaceful slumber. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the wall between hearts. In the heart of Europe, where ancient rivers whispered secrets to cobblestone streets, there stood a city that had known both triumph and tragedy. Berlin, once the proud capital of a mighty empire, now lay split like a broken heart, its two halves beating with different rhythms, separated by concrete and wire, ideology and fear. The year was 1961, and summer had painted the city in golden hues that seemed to mock the growing tension in the air. Children played in parks on both sides of what would soon become an impenetrable barrier, their laughter carrying across invisible lines that adults had drawn with bitter precision. In the warm evening light, families gathered around dinner tables, unaware that some would wake to find their loved ones on the other side of a wall that would rise like a concrete curtain between their worlds. Wilhelm Richter was 24 that summer, a young man with gentle eyes the color of autumn leaves and hands that knew the weight of books better than tools. He worked as a librarian in West Berlin's Charlottenburg district, spending his days among towering shelves filled with stories from around the world. Books were his passion, knowledge his sanctuary, and in the quiet corners of the library, he would often lose himself in tales of distant lands and impossible loves. On the eastern side of the city, where the scent of fresh bread still wafted from corner bakeries despite the growing shortages, lived Elena Müller. 22 years old, with hair like spun gold and eyes that held the depth of northern seas, she was a teacher at a small school in Prenzlauer Berg. Her students adored her gentle manner and the way she could make even the most complex mathematical concepts seem like beautiful puzzles waiting to be solved. In her small apartment, surrounded by potted plants and handmade quilts, Elena would spend her evenings reading by lamplight, dreaming of places beyond the gray buildings and watchful eyes of her neighborhood. Neither Wilhelm nor Elena knew of each other's existence yet, though fate was already weaving invisible threads between their hearts. They lived parallel lives, separated by mere kilometers, but worlds apart in the political reality that was slowly tightening around Berlin like a noose. Both shared a love of literature. Both questioned the growing divisions they saw around them, and both felt a deep longing for something they couldn't quite name, a connection that transcended the barriers being built not just in their city but in their hearts. The summer of 1961 was particularly beautiful, with long, lazy days that seemed to stretch endlessly under brilliant blue skies. In West Berlin, American jazz music drifted from cafe windows, mixing with the sounds of construction as the city rebuilt itself from the rubble of war. The Marshall Plan had brought prosperity and hope, filling shop windows with goods from around the world and giving young people dreams of bright futures. Wilhelm would often walk through the bustling streets after work, marveling at the energy and optimism that seemed to radiate from every corner. Meanwhile, in East Berlin, the atmosphere was more subdued but no less meaningful. Community gardens flourished between apartment blocks. Neighbors knew each other's names and stories, and there was a quiet pride in the collective effort to build something new from the ashes of the old world. Elena would often join her neighbors for evening walks along tree-lined boulevards, discussing philosophy and poetry as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Despite the political tensions and economic challenges, there was still beauty to be found in simple human connections and shared aspirations. But beneath the surface calm, currents of change were already stirring. Families began to notice relatives disappearing in the night, fleeing from east to west through an increasingly porous border. The East German government watched with growing alarm as their citizens voted with their feet, leaving behind everything they knew for the promise of freedom and prosperity in the West. Something had to be done, they decided, to stop this hemorrhaging of people and preserve the socialist experiment they were trying to build. Wilhelm first sensed something was wrong on a humid August evening as he walked home from the library. The usual flow of people between the sectors had slowed to a trickle, and he noticed more soldiers than usual patrolling the crossing points. The air itself seemed heavy with unspoken tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm when even the birds fall silent. He paused at a cafe near Checkpoint Charlie, ordering a coffee he didn't really want, just to sit and watch. The nervous glances exchanged between the guards on both sides of the border. That same evening, Elena noticed her neighbors speaking in hushed tones, their usual animated discussions replaced by worried whispers. Mrs. Schmidt from downstairs had been crying, Elena realized, her eyes red and puffy as she hurried past in the hallway. The elderly woman's son had been planning to visit his sister in West Berlin that weekend, a routine trip that families had made freely for years. But something in the air suggested that such simple freedoms might soon become impossible luxuries. Neither Wilhelm nor Elena slept well that night. In their separate apartments, they both found themselves drawn to their windows, gazing out at a city that seemed to be holding its breath. The stars above Berlin shone with the same ancient light that had watched over the city through centuries of change, but somehow even they seemed dimmer, as if sensing the darkness that was about to fall. August 13, 1961, dawned gray and somber, with low clouds hanging over Berlin like a shroud. Wilhelm woke to the sound of trucks rumbling through the streets, their engines creating a mechanical symphony that seemed to echo from every direction. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, only to find his world transformed overnight. Where there had been open streets and flowing crowds, now there were coils of barbed wire, armed guards, and the ominous presence of construction equipment preparing to build something permanent and terrible. Elena's awakening was even more jarring. The sound of hammering and shouting had pulled her from uneasy dreams, and when she looked out her window, she saw workers erecting a barrier just 2 blocks from her apartment. The familiar street where she had walked to school every day for the past 3 years was now divided by a growing wall of concrete blocks and razor wire. Neighbors stood in small groups, pointing and whispering, their faces etched with disbelief and growing fear. The Berlin Wall had been born overnight, a concrete manifestation of the ideological divide that had been growing between East and West since the end of World War II. In a matter of hours, families were separated, lovers torn apart, and an entire city carved into 2 distinct worlds that would remain isolated from each other for nearly 3 decades. The Iron Curtain, which had been a metaphor across Europe, had become a physical reality in the heart of Berlin. Wilhelm spent that first day walking the length of the new barrier, his heart breaking a little more with each step. He saw elderly men weeping as they realized they might never again visit their childhood homes, just a few hundred meters away but now completely inaccessible. Young mothers pressed their faces against the wire, calling out to relatives on the other side, their voices growing hoarse with desperation and disbelief. The wall was not just dividing a city, it was tearing apart the very fabric of human connection that had held Berlin together through its darkest hours. Elena's experience was similarly heartbreaking. Several of her students lived on the western side of the city, and had been commuting to her school every day. Now, their desks would remain empty, their education interrupted by political decisions made in distant offices by men who had never sat in a classroom and watched children's faces light up with understanding. She stood at her classroom window, looking out at a playground that had once echoed with the laughter of children from both sides of the city, now silent and divided by barbed wire and concrete. As days turned into weeks, both Wilhelm and Elena fell into new routines shaped by the reality of their divided city. Wilhelm found himself drawn to the border area repeatedly, not out of morbid curiosity, but from a deep need to understand what had happened to his world. He began collecting stories from the people he met there, refugees who had escaped just in time, families separated by mere meters but infinite distance, lovers who had been caught on different sides when the wall went up. These stories became his obsession, and he started writing them down, creating an informal archive of human tragedy and resilience. Elena coped by throwing herself into her teaching with even greater passion. If she couldn't change the larger world, she reasoned, she could at least nurture the minds of the children in her care. She began incorporating more literature and philosophy into her mathematics lessons, showing her students how numbers could be beautiful, how equations could reveal hidden truths about the universe, how knowledge itself was a form of freedom that no wall could contain. Her classroom became a sanctuary of learning and hope in a world that seemed increasingly constrained by fear and ideology. The wall itself evolved during those first months, growing higher and more sophisticated as the East German authorities worked to perfect their barrier. What had begun as hastily strung barbed wire was replaced by concrete blocks, then by prefabricated concrete slabs that rose 12 feet high and stretched for nearly 30 miles around West Berlin. Watchtowers sprouted like mechanical flowers along its length, manned by guards who had been trained to shoot anyone attempting to cross. The no-man's land between the barriers became a deadly strip of raked sand, motion detectors, and guard dogs, a monument to human division and fear. But even as the physical barrier grew stronger, the human spirit on both sides remained unbroken. West Berliners began leaving flowers and notes at the wall, creating impromptu memorials for those who had died trying to cross. East Berliners found subtle ways to show their dissent: a flower left on a doorstep, graffiti that appeared and disappeared in the night, small acts of kindness between neighbors that affirmed their shared humanity despite the political system trying to control them. Wilhelm started visiting a small cafe near Checkpoint Charlie, where he would sit for hours with his notebook, writing down the stories he collected. The cafe owner, an elderly man named Hans who had lived through both world wars, would bring Wilhelm coffee and sit with him sometimes, sharing his own memories of a time when Berlin had been whole. "Walls are built by men," Hans would say, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup. And what men build, men can tear down. The question is not whether this wall will fall, but when and what we will have learned by then about the price of division. On the eastern side, Elena found her own form of quiet resistance. She began organizing underground reading groups, where teachers from across East Berlin would gather to discuss books that weren't officially approved, to share ideas that couldn't be spoken in public, to maintain connections that transcended political boundaries. These meetings took place in different homes each week, always in small groups, always carefully planned to avoid detection. But they provided something invaluable, a sense of intellectual freedom and human connection that no amount of concrete and wire could completely suppress. As 1961 drew to a close, both Wilhelm and Elena had been forever changed by the events they had witnessed. Wilhelm's collection of stories had grown into several notebooks, each filled with accounts of human drama played out against the backdrop of political division. He had become a chronicler of his time, documenting not just the historical events, but the personal cost of ideological conflict. His gentle nature had been tempered by exposure to so much suffering, but it had also been strengthened by witnessing countless examples of human courage and compassion. Elena had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. The young woman who had once been content to live quietly with her books and plants had become a leader in her small community, someone to whom others turned for guidance and inspiration. Her underground reading groups had evolved into networks of support for families separated by the wall, helping to pass messages across the barrier and maintain connections that the authorities were trying to sever. She had learned that love and knowledge were forms of resistance, and that teaching was not just a profession, but a calling to preserve human dignity in the face of dehumanizing forces. The wall that had been built to separate them had, in its way, begun to define them both. Neither Wilhelm nor Elena could have imagined that their parallel journeys of growth and discovery were preparing them for a love story that would span decades and ultimately help to tear down the very barrier that seemed so permanent and imposing. But fate works in mysterious ways, weaving together the threads of individual lives to create tapestries of meaning that can only be seen from the perspective of time and distance. As snow began to fall on Berlin in December 1961, covering the harsh edges of the wall with a blanket of white that made the city look almost peaceful again, both Wilhelm and Elena found themselves standing at their respective sides of the barrier, each unknown to the other, but both sharing the same thought. Somewhere on the other side of this concrete and wire, there might be someone who understood the pain of division, someone who shared their dreams of a world without walls, someone whose heart beat with the same rhythm of hope and longing that kept them going through these dark times. Little did they know that their wishes were about to be answered in ways they could never have imagined, and that the wall, which had seemed like an ending, was actually just the beginning of a love story that would help define an entire generation's struggle for freedom and connection. 3 years had passed since the wall had divided Berlin, and the city had settled into an uneasy rhythm of separation. The initial shock and desperate attempts at escape had given way to a more subtle form of resistance, the human heart's refusal to accept that love, friendship, and family bonds could be severed by concrete and wire. Both sides of the city had adapted to their new reality, but beneath the surface, 1,000 small acts of defiance continued to chip away at the barriers between East and West. Wilhelm had grown into his role as an unofficial chronicler of the divided city. His notebooks had multiplied, filled with stories that painted a portrait of Berlin's wounded heart. The library where he worked had become an informal meeting place for those seeking to maintain connections across the divide, and Wilhelm found himself at the center of a network of people determined to keep the spirit of unity alive. He had aged beyond his years, his gentle features now marked by the weight of the stories he carried, but his eyes still held the same compassion that had drawn people to him since childhood. Elena had blossomed into a beacon of quiet strength in East Berlin. Her underground reading groups had evolved into something more significant, a network of educators, artists, and thinkers who maintained intellectual freedom in a system that sought to control every aspect of human thought. She had learned to speak in code, to find beauty in small gestures, and to nurture hope in the darkest circumstances. Her apartment had become a sanctuary where forbidden books were shared, where questions could be asked without fear, and where the human spirit could flourish despite external constraints. It was in the spring of 1964 that fate finally began to weave their stories together. Wilhelm had been working on a project to collect letters from families separated by the wall, hoping to create a historical record of the human cost of division. Through his network of contacts, he had learned of a teacher in East Berlin who was helping students write to relatives they could no longer visit. The teacher's name was Elena Müller, and she had developed an ingenious system for getting these letters across the border through diplomatic channels and sympathetic contacts. Elena had indeed been helping her students maintain connections with family members in West Berlin. She understood that for children, the separation from grandparents, cousins, and friends was particularly traumatic, and she had made it her mission to help heal these wounds through the power of written words. Her students would write letters during their free time, pouring their hearts onto paper in messages that Elena would then find ways to deliver through a carefully constructed network of teachers, clergy, and other sympathetic souls. The first communication between Wilhelm and Elena came through an intermediary, a Catholic priest named Father Müller, who had maintained contacts on both sides of the wall. Wilhelm had approached him about collecting letters for his historical project, while Elena had been using his services to help her students' messages reach their destinations. Father Müller, recognizing kindred spirits when he saw them, decided to introduce them indirectly by including a note from Wilhelm with one of Elena's letter deliveries. Wilhelm's note was simple and respectful. "Dear teacher, I have heard of your work helping children maintain connections with their families. I am documenting the stories of our divided city, and I would be honored to help ensure that these young voices are preserved for history. Perhaps we might correspond about this project. W. Richter, Charlottenburg Library." He had written it quickly, not expecting much response, but something about the idea of this unknown teacher dedicating herself to healing the wounds of separation had touched him deeply. Elena received the note on a gray April afternoon, tucked between the regular correspondence she received from Father Müller. She read it 3 times, surprised by the gentle tone and the obvious sincerity behind the words. In her experience, most men in positions of authority, and a librarian in West Berlin surely qualified as such, spoke with a certain presumption of importance. But this W. Richter seemed different, approaching her work with respect and genuine interest rather than condescension or political agenda. Her response came a week later, also delivered through Father Müller. "Dear Mr. Richter, thank you for your interest in preserving these stories. The children I teach have much to say about separation and hope, and perhaps their words deserve a wider audience than my small classroom. I would be pleased to correspond about this project. E. Müller, teacher, Prenzlauer Berg." She had debated over every word, knowing that even this innocent exchange could be dangerous if discovered by the wrong people. Thus began a correspondence that would span years and eventually grow into something neither of them had expected. Their letters started as formal exchanges about the project of documenting divided families, but gradually evolved into something more personal and profound. They discovered shared passions for literature, philosophy, and the power of education to transform lives. Wilhelm wrote about his work at the library, his growing collection of stories, his walks along the wall where he would stand for hours wondering about the lives being lived just meters away. Elena shared her experiences in the classroom, her underground reading groups, her small garden where she grew vegetables and flowers as acts of defiance against the gray uniformity of her neighborhood. Their letters became longer and more frequent as the months passed. Wilhelm found himself looking forward to Elena's responses with an anticipation that surprised him, while Elena discovered that writing to her mysterious correspondent had become the highlight of her week. They began including small gifts with their letters, pressed flowers from Elena's garden, poems Wilhelm had found that reminded him of her descriptions of East Berlin, photographs of their respective neighborhoods that allowed each to see the world through the other's eyes. By the winter of 1000, 964, their correspondence had taken on an intimacy that neither had experienced before. Wilhelm wrote, "Dear Elena, may I call you Elena? Your letter about the first snow in your courtyard made me realize that we are looking at the same sky, breathing the same air, living under the same stars despite this wall between us. Sometimes I walk to the barrier at night and wonder if you are doing the same on your side, and if perhaps our thoughts might meet somewhere in the space above the concrete and wire." Elena's response revealed her own growing feelings. "Dear Wilhelm, yes, you may call me Elena, as I have been thinking of you as Wilhelm for months now. I do indeed walk to the wall sometimes, especially on clear nights when the stars seem bright enough to light a path across any barrier. It comforts me to think that you might be there too, that we might be sharing the same moment of hope across this divide. Your letters have become my windows to a world I cannot visit, and your thoughts have become companions to my own." As their correspondence deepened, they began to share more personal details of their lives. Wilhelm wrote about his childhood in Berlin before the wall, his memories of a unified city where children could play in any park and families could gather from all corners of the metropolis. He described his parents, who had died in the war, and his quiet life among books and stories. Elena shared her own history, growing up in a small town east of Berlin, coming to the city to study and teach, her dreams of travel and discovery that had been curtailed by political realities. They discovered remarkable similarities in their perspectives on life, love, and the human condition. Both believed in the power of knowledge to transcend political boundaries. Both felt deeply the tragedy of their divided city, and both harbored dreams of a future where walls would be unnecessary because understanding would make them obsolete. Wilhelm wrote, "I believe that love and knowledge are the same force, Elena. Both involve opening oneself to something larger, both require courage, and both have the power to transform the world." Elena responded, "Your words echo thoughts I have had but never been able to express so clearly. Perhaps this is why teaching children feels like an act of love to me. Each lesson is a small gesture of faith in a better future." By the spring of 1965, they had been corresponding for almost a year, and their letters had evolved into love letters in all but name. Wilhelm wrote, "Elena, I find myself dreaming of conversations we have never had, imagining walks through gardens I have never seen, picturing your face when you laugh at something your students have said. Is it possible to love someone you have never met, to feel complete with someone you have only known through words on paper?" Elena's response was equally revealing. "Wilhelm, I have fallen in love with your mind, your heart, your vision of what the world could become. When I read your letters, I feel less alone, less trapped by circumstances beyond my control. You have given me the gift of hope, and that is the most precious thing anyone can offer." Their letters began to include more elaborate plans for a future meeting, though both knew how dangerous and difficult such an encounter would be. Wilhelm investigated every possible way to cross into East Berlin legally, while Elena explored options for visits to the West. But the bureaucratic barriers seemed almost as insurmountable as the physical wall itself. Still, they planned as if anything were possible, describing the restaurants where they would dine, the museums they would visit together, the long walks they would take through a reunified city. Father Müller, who continued to serve as their messenger, watched their relationship develop with a mixture of joy and concern. He was happy to see love flourishing despite political obstacles, but he also worried about the potential consequences if their correspondence were discovered by the authorities. He began taking extra precautions, varying his routes and methods of delivery, sometimes waiting weeks between messages to avoid establishing patterns that might be detected by surveillance. The summer of 1965 brought new challenges and new possibilities. Elena's underground reading group had been discovered by the authorities, though fortunately she and most of her colleagues had escaped serious consequences due to the group's focus on literature rather than explicitly political material. Still, she was now under closer scrutiny, and continuing her correspondence with Wilhelm became even more dangerous. Wilhelm, meanwhile, had been promoted to head librarian, a position that gave him more resources and contacts, but also more visibility and responsibility. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, their letters became even more passionate and committed. Wilhelm wrote, "Elena, whatever happens, I want you to know that these 2 years of correspondence have been the most meaningful of my life. You have taught me that love is not about proximity but about connection, not about what we can see but about what we can understand. If we never meet in person, I will still consider myself blessed to have known your heart through these letters." Elena responded with equal emotion. "Wilhelm, you have been my anchor in storms I could not have weathered alone. Through your words, I have learned that walls exist only where we allow them to exist. In my heart, there is no barrier between us, and there never will be." As autumn arrived in Berlin, bringing with it the 4th anniversary of their divided city, both Wilhelm and Elena began to contemplate the possibility that they might never meet. The wall showed no signs of weakening, and if anything, the political tensions between East and West seemed to be hardening further. But their love had transcended physical limitations, creating a bond that existed in the realm of mind and spirit where no authority could reach. Wilhelm's letters from this period reflected a mature acceptance of their situation, combined with undiminished hope. "My darling Elena, I have come to understand that our love story is not constrained by the usual rules of romance. We have built something beautiful, and lasting from nothing more than words and faith, proving that the human heart recognizes no boundaries. Whether we meet tomorrow or in 20 years, what we have created together is real and permanent and sacred. Elena's response showed similar wisdom and devotion. My dearest Wilhelm, you have taught me that love is not something that happens to us, but something we create through choice and commitment and daily acts of faith. I choose to love you across this wall, across the years, across whatever obstacles may come. Our correspondence has become my most treasured possession, and your love has become my most powerful source of strength. As 1965 drew to a close, Wilhelm and Elena had established a relationship that defied conventional definitions. They were lovers who had never touched, best friends who had never spoken aloud, companions who shared everything except physical space. Their letters had become a literary monument to the power of human connection to transcend any barrier, and their love had become a quiet form of resistance against the forces that sought to keep them apart. Neither could know that their patient, faithful correspondence was preparing them for changes that would come to Berlin in the years ahead, or that their love story would eventually become part of the larger story of their city's journey toward freedom. For now, it was enough that they had found each other across the divide, that their words had built bridges where politicians had constructed walls, and that their hearts had learned to beat in harmony, despite being separated by concrete and wire and the vast machinery of ideological conflict. The snow that fell on Berlin that December covered both sides of the wall with the same gentle beauty, and both Wilhelm and Elena stood at their respective barriers on Christmas Eve, knowing without communication that the other was there, sharing the same moment of hope beneath the same stars that had watched over their love story from its beginning. Their letters had taught them that love was not about possessing someone, but about knowing them completely, and in that knowledge they were already as close as two hearts could be. The late 1960s brought tumultuous changes to the world, with youth movements and political upheavals sweeping across Europe and America. But the Berlin Wall stood firm, its concrete slabs weathered but unmoving, a seemingly permanent fixture in the divided landscape of the Cold War. For Wilhelm and Elena, now corresponding for over 5 years, their relationship had deepened into something that transcended the usual boundaries of romance, becoming a profound spiritual and intellectual partnership that sustained them both through an era of increasing uncertainty. Wilhelm had established himself as one of West Berlin's most respected librarians, using his position not just to serve the community, but to create an underground network of information exchange that helped keep families connected across the divide. His collection of stories had grown into a comprehensive archive of life in divided Berlin, drawing the attention of historians and journalists who recognized the value of his documentation. But Wilhelm's true passion remained his correspondence with Elena, which had evolved into a daily practice of sharing not just events but thoughts, dreams, fears, and the small observations that make up the texture of daily life. Elena had navigated the political complexities of East Berlin with remarkable skill, maintaining her teaching position while continuing her quiet work of intellectual resistance. Her classroom had become legendary among parents and students for the way she managed to include forbidden ideas and perspectives within the approved curriculum, teaching children to think critically while appearing to conform to state requirements. Her letters to Wilhelm had become the outlet for thoughts and feelings that she could share with no one else in her daily life, making their correspondence essential to her emotional and intellectual survival. The mechanics of their letter exchange had become increasingly sophisticated over the years. Father Müller had been joined by a network of sympathetic individuals, a postal worker with relatives on both sides, a diplomat's wife who traveled frequently between sectors, a musician who performed in both East and West and could carry messages in his instrument case. They had developed codes and hiding places, backup plans and alternative routes, turning the simple act of sending a letter into an elaborate dance of secrecy and trust. By 1968, their correspondence had taken on almost mythical proportions among those who knew of it. Wilhelm's colleagues at the library spoke in whispers about his great love affair, while Elena's trusted friends marveled at her devotion to a man she had never seen. Their story had become a symbol of hope for others separated by the wall, proof that love could endure any obstacle and that human connection could transcend political boundaries. The letters themselves had evolved into works of art, filled with philosophical reflections, literary observations, and intimate details that painted vivid pictures of their respective worlds. Wilhelm wrote, "My beloved Elena, today I watched the sun set behind the wall and imagined that the same golden light was falling on your garden, connecting us through something as simple and eternal as sunshine. I have been thinking about how love changes us, not by making us different people, but by helping us become more fully who we were always meant to be. Your love has made me braver, more compassionate, more aware of the beauty that exists even in our divided world." Elena's responses reflected similar depth and poetry. "My darling Wilhelm, your words about love transforming us have stayed with me for days. I see it in my teaching. When I help a child understand a difficult concept, there is a moment of recognition, of becoming, that reminds me of what happened to my heart when I first read your letters. You have awakened parts of me that I didn't know existed, and through your eyes, I have learned to see beauty where I once saw only barriers. Our love has taught me that freedom is not about where you can go, but about who you can become. As the political climate in Europe shifted and tensions between East and West fluctuated, Wilhelm and Elena found themselves serving as informal witnesses to history. The Prague Spring of 1968 brought hope and then crushing disappointment as Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, reminding everyone that the divisions in Europe were far from theoretical. Wilhelm's letters from this period reflected the mix of hope and despair that characterized the era. Elena, watching the events in Prague unfold, has made me think about the nature of change. Sometimes transformation comes gradually, like the way our love has deepened over years of correspondence, and sometimes it erupts suddenly, like the uprising of students and workers demanding freedom. I pray that when change comes to our Berlin, it will be of the gentle kind, though I fear the forces that built this wall will not give up their power without struggle. Elena's perspective from the eastern side provided equally valuable insights. Wilhelm, the news from Prague has reached us here, though of course the official reports tell a very different story from what people whisper in private. My students ask questions I cannot answer directly, but I see in their eyes the same hunger for truth that I have carried in my own heart for so long. Perhaps our correspondence has been preparing us for larger changes, teaching us that patience and persistence can overcome even the most formidable barriers. The early 1970s brought new challenges and new depths to their relationship. Wilhelm's father figure, the elderly cafe owner Hans, passed away, leaving Wilhelm feeling more isolated but also more determined to preserve the connections that mattered most. Elena faced her own losses when several members of her underground reading group were arrested and imprisoned, forcing her to become even more careful about her activities while maintaining her commitment to intellectual freedom. During this difficult period, their letters became lifelines for both of them. Wilhelm wrote, "My darling, in times of loss and uncertainty, I find myself returning again and again to the certainty of our love. When everything else seems fragile and temporary, the bond we have created through these years of correspondence feels solid and eternal. You have become not just my beloved, but my anchor, the fixed point around which all other experiences arrange themselves into meaning." Elena's response showed similar reliance on their connection. "Wilhelm, you write of me as your anchor, but you have been my North Star, the constant light that helps me navigate through the darkness of difficult times. When friends disappear and familiar routines are disrupted, I know that somewhere across this wall, someone understands my heart completely. Our love has become my religion, our correspondence my prayer, our shared dreams my faith in a better future." As the 1970s progressed, both Wilhelm and Elena entered their 30s, fully formed adults whose personalities had been shaped in large part by their unique love story. Their letters began to include more practical considerations alongside the philosophical and romantic observations that had always characterized their correspondence. They discussed the possibility of never meeting, the question of whether their love could survive physical encounter, and the ways their relationship had changed them as individuals. Wilhelm's reflections on their decade-long correspondence revealed remarkable maturity. Elena, I have been thinking about the nature of our relationship and how it differs from conventional romance. We have built something that exists purely in the realm of mind and spirit, uncompromised by the small disappointments and adjustments that characterize most partnerships. But I wonder sometimes if this makes our love more perfect or less real. Do we love each other, or do we love the ideas we have created of each other through words on paper? Elena's response demonstrated equal thoughtfulness. Wilhelm, your question has haunted me for weeks, and I keep returning to the same conclusion. What we love in each other is not fantasy, but essence, the deepest truths about who we are, revealed through years of honest communication. Physical presence might add dimensions to our love, but it could never change the fundamental connection we have discovered. We know each other's souls, and that knowledge is the most real thing in my life. The mid-1970s brought subtle but significant changes to the political landscape of Berlin. Détente between the superpowers created new possibilities for cultural exchange and limited contact between East and West, though the wall itself remained as imposing as ever. Wilhelm and Elena began to hear stories of other separated couples who had managed brief meetings through official channels, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to seriously consider the possibility of a face-to-face encounter. Their letters during this period reflected cautious optimism mixed with fear of disappointment. Wilhelm wrote, "My love, the thought that we might actually meet fills me with joy and terror in equal measure. What if the magic we have created through letters cannot survive the reality of physical presence? What if we are better as dream lovers than as flesh and blood companions? And yet, despite these fears, I long to hold your hand, to see your face when you smile, to share silence as well as words." Elena's response revealed similar ambivalence. "Wilhelm, I share your fears and your hopes about meeting. Sometimes I dream about our first embrace, and sometimes I wake in terror that reality might shatter the beautiful love we have built through imagination and faith. But then I remember that our correspondence has always been about truth-telling, about revealing ourselves completely to each other. Surely two people who have shared their souls so completely have nothing to fear from sharing physical space." The bureaucratic process of arranging a meeting proved to be almost as complex as their years of secret correspondence. Wilhelm applied for permits to visit East Berlin, while Elena sought permission to travel to the West, both knowing that success was unlikely but determined to try. The applications required detailed explanations of their relationship, extensive background checks, and reviews by multiple levels of authority on both sides of the divide. While waiting for official responses, they continued their correspondence with intensified passion and commitment. Wilhelm wrote, "Elena, whether or not we ever meet in person, I want you to know that you have been the great love of my life. You have taught me that intimacy is not about physical proximity but about emotional honesty, that romance is not about grand gestures but about daily acts of attention and care. Through loving you, I have learned to love more fully, to hope more deeply, to believe more strongly in the power of human connection to transcend any obstacle." Elena's letters from this period were equally profound. "My dearest Wilhelm, our love story has taught me that the most important boundaries exist not in the physical world, but in our own hearts and minds. We have chosen to love across distance, across difference, across the vast machinery of political division, and that choice has made us free in ways that no government can control. Whether we meet tomorrow or never, you have already given me the greatest gift one person can give another, the experience of being completely known and completely loved." The late 1970s brought disappointing news about their applications for meeting permits. Both had been denied, with official letters citing security concerns and the need to maintain proper boundaries between the two sides of the city. The rejection was painful but not unexpected, and both Wilhelm and Elena had learned over the years to find meaning and joy within the constraints of their situation, rather than allowing frustration to poison their love. Wilhelm's response to the rejection revealed remarkable resilience. "My beloved Elena, I confess that I wept when I received the official denial of my application, but my tears were brief. How can I mourn the loss of something I never had when I am so grateful for what we have created together? Our love exists in letters, in dreams, in the space between words where understanding lives. No bureaucrat can deny us access to that sacred territory." Elena's reaction was similarly mature and philosophical. "Wilhelm, disappointment has taught me to treasure what we have even more deeply. Perhaps our love was always meant to exist in this pure form, uncomplicated by the mundane realities that so often diminish earthly romance. We are lovers of minds and souls, companions of the heart, partners in the grand adventure of being human in an inhumane world. What more could we ask for than to love and be loved so completely?" As the 1970s drew to a close, Wilhelm and Elena had been corresponding for 15 years, creating a body of letters that chronicled not just their personal love story, but the evolution of divided Berlin and the persistent human hope for reunification. Their relationship had become legendary among those who knew of it, a symbol of love's ability to transcend any barrier and a testament to the power of faith and patience in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. The wall that had brought them together by separating them continued to dominate the landscape of their city, but its psychological power over them had diminished. They had learned to live and love within constraints, to find freedom in imagination, to create intimacy through words alone. Their letters had become a parallel universe where anything was possible, where love was stronger than politics, where two hearts could beat as one despite being separated by concrete and wire and the vast machinery of ideological conflict. Neither Wilhelm nor Elena could know that the world was about to change in ways that would make their long patience seem like preparation for a miracle. The forces that had seemed so permanent and unshakable were already beginning to weaken, though the signs were subtle and the changes would come slowly at first, then all at once. But for now, it was enough that they had loved faithfully across the years, that their correspondence had created something beautiful and lasting, and that their story had become part of the larger story of human resilience and hope in the face of division and despair. As snow fell on Berlin on the last night of 1979, both Wilhelm and Elena stood at their respective sides of the wall, each knowing without communication that the other was there, sharing the same moment of reflection beneath the same stars that had witnessed their love story from its beginning. Their letters had taught them that some forms of love are so pure and powerful that they need no physical expression, that some bonds are so deep that no force on earth can sever them. In that knowledge, they were already as united as two hearts could be, ready for whatever the new decade might bring to their divided city and their enduring love. The 1980s arrived in Berlin with a sense of anticipation that few could have articulated, but many felt in the depths of their hearts. The wall remained as imposing as ever, its concrete slabs now covered with graffiti on the western side, creating a strange artistic monument to division that drew visitors from around the world. But beneath the surface of apparent permanence, subtle currents of change were beginning to stir, carried by economic pressures, generational shifts, and the growing weariness of populations on both sides who had lived too long with the consequences of ideological division. Wilhelm, now in his 40s, had become something of an institution in West Berlin, his library serving as an unofficial cultural center where East and West Germans could encounter each other through books, letters, and shared stories. His correspondence with Elena had continued unbroken for nearly 20 years, evolving into a mature partnership of minds and souls that provided stability and meaning in an uncertain world. His collection of divided Berlin stories had grown into a comprehensive archive that scholars and journalists consulted regularly, making him an inadvertent historian of one of the 20th century's most significant human experiments in separation. Elena, approaching her 40th birthday, had navigated the complexities of East German society with remarkable grace, earning respect as both an educator and a quiet advocate for intellectual freedom. Her classroom had become a sanctuary where critical thinking flourished within the careful bounds of political acceptability, and her former students, now adults, often credited her with teaching them not just mathematics, but how to think independently in a society that discouraged such habits. Her letters to Wilhelm remained the cornerstone of her emotional life, providing an outlet for thoughts and feelings that could be shared with no one else in her increasingly surveilled world. The early 1980s brought new leadership to both sides of the Cold War divide, and with it subtle changes in the rhetoric and possibilities surrounding East-West relations. Ronald Reagan's presidency in America and Mikhail Gorbachev's eventual rise to power in the Soviet Union created a dynamic tension between confrontation and cooperation that would ultimately reshape the entire European landscape. Wilhelm and Elena, veteran observers of political change through their years of correspondence, watched these developments with cautious hope tempered by decades of disappointment. Their letters during this period reflected a mature understanding of how personal relationships intersect with historical forces. Wilhelm wrote, "My darling Elena, I find myself wondering if our 20-year correspondence has been preparing us for changes we cannot yet imagine. We have learned to love across impossible distances, to maintain faith despite constant obstacles, to find hope in the smallest openings. Perhaps these are exactly the skills our city will need as the world around us continues to shift and change." Elena's response demonstrated similar wisdom. "Wilhelm, your words about preparation resonate deeply with me. We have become experts in patience, specialists in hope, professionals in the art of loving without possessing. If Berlin is ever to be reunited, it will need citizens who understand how to bridge differences, how to maintain connections across divides, how to build trust slowly and carefully over time. Our correspondence has been a 20-year masterclass in exactly these skills." As the mid-1980s approached, both Wilhelm and Elena began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of their respective sides of the city. In West Berlin, there was growing discussion of German reunification, no longer whispered as an impossible dream, but spoken aloud as a distant but conceivable possibility. In East Berlin, economic pressures and social tensions were creating cracks in the facade of socialist prosperity, leading to more open criticism of government policies and more frequent attempts at illegal border crossings. Their network of letter carriers had evolved over the years into a sophisticated underground railroad of communication, involving dozens of individuals who facilitated not just Wilhelm and Elena's correspondence, but connections between hundreds of separated families. Father Muller, now in his 70s, but still actively involved in their letter exchange, often marveled at how their simple love story had inspired a broader movement of connection and resistance. "You too have shown others what is possible," he told Wilhelm during one of their regular meetings. "Your love has become a beacon of hope for an entire city." The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev as Soviet leader in 1985 marked a turning point that few fully understood at the time. His policies of glasnost and perestroika began to create openings in the Iron Curtain that had seemed welded shut for decades. Wilhelm and Elena, seasoned observers of political rhetoric, were initially skeptical, but gradually began to allow themselves to hope that real change might be possible. Wilhelm's letters from this period reflected cautious optimism. "Elena, I hardly dare to write these words, but I sense something shifting in the world around us. The language of diplomacy is changing. The possibilities for contact between East and West are expanding, and even the guards at Checkpoint Charlie seem less rigid than they once were. Could it be that our patient faith is about to be rewarded in ways we never dared to imagine?" Elena's responses showed similar tentative hope. "My dearest Wilhelm, I too sense changes in the air, though I try not to let hope overwhelm caution. My students ask more questions now, speak more freely about their dreams and aspirations, challenge authority in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Perhaps the wall that has divided us externally is beginning to crumble internally in the hearts and minds of people who have grown tired of artificial separation." The late 1980s brought increasingly dramatic changes to the political landscape of Eastern Europe. Hungary began dismantling its border fence with Austria. Poland elected a non-communist government, and protests in various Soviet bloc countries grew larger and more frequent. Each development was reported differently on the two sides of Berlin, but Wilhelm and Elena, through their network of contacts and their own careful observation, were able to piece together a picture of a world in transformation. Their correspondence during this crucial period became a real-time chronicle of history in the making. Wilhelm wrote, "Elena, I can barely contain my excitement about the changes sweeping across Eastern Europe. Every day brings news that would have seemed impossible just months ago. I find myself walking to the wall more frequently, not in sadness as I have for so many years, but with something approaching anticipation. Could it be that the barrier that brought us together by separating us might soon be removed?" Elena's letters reflected similar excitement mixed with disbelief. "Wilhelm, the changes happening around us feel like living inside a fairy tale where impossible things become reality. My colleagues speak openly now about reunification, about the possibility of travel, about futures we had not dared to imagine. I catch myself planning trips to West Berlin, imagining walking freely through streets I have only heard you describe. Most of all, I dream of the moment when we might finally meet face to face. As 1989 dawned, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. Mass demonstrations in East Germany grew larger and more frequent. Demands for political reform became impossible to ignore, and the East German government found itself increasingly isolated as its Soviet sponsors withdrew support. Wilhelm and Elena, now corresponding almost daily through their expanded network of supporters, documented these historic events from their unique perspectives on both sides of the divide. The spring and summer of 1989 brought unprecedented developments. Thousands of East Germans fled through Hungary and Poland, putting enormous pressure on the East German government to either seal its borders completely or allow greater freedom of movement. Wilhelm and Elena watched these events unfold with fascination and growing hope, their 25-year correspondence having prepared them to recognize the significance of each small opening, each subtle shift in official policy. Wilhelm's letters from this period pulsed with excitement. "My beloved Elena, I can hardly sleep for thinking about the possibilities before us. Today I saw thousands of people gathered near the Brandenburg Gate, and for the first time in decades, they were not looking at the wall with despair, but with expectation. The city itself seems to be awakening from a long dream, and I feel as though our patient love has somehow contributed to this awakening." Elena's responses were equally euphoric. "Wilhelm, the atmosphere here is electric with possibility. Students who once sat quietly in my classroom now debate politics openly. Neighbors who once whispered about escape now discuss reunification as though it were inevitable. I have begun to plan what I will wear when we finally meet, how I will recognize you, what words will be adequate for a moment we have imagined for 25 years. By autumn 1989, the situation in East Germany had become increasingly unstable. Massive demonstrations in Leipzig and other cities demanded political reform, freedom of travel, and ultimately reunification with West Germany. The East German government, caught between an unwilling Soviet sponsor and an increasingly rebellious population, began to make concessions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Wilhelm and Elena's correspondence during these crucial weeks became a minute-by-minute chronicle of revolutionary change. Wilhelm wrote on November 6th, "Elena, rumors are spreading that the government is about to announce new travel policies. I can barely contain my hope, even as I try to prepare myself for disappointment. But something feels different this time. The momentum seems unstoppable, as though history itself has decided that walls and barriers have outlived their purpose." Elena's letter of November 8th proved prophetic. "My dearest Wilhelm, I write this with trembling hands because I believe we are about to witness something miraculous. The pressure for change has become irresistible, and I sense that our long separation is about to end. If the impossible becomes possible, if the wall that has defined our love story is about to fall, then our 25 years of patient faith will be revealed as preparation for a joy beyond our wildest dreams. Neither Wilhelm nor Elena slept well on the night of November 8, 1989, though neither could have known that their long vigil was about to end. On both sides of the wall, people gathered in unusual numbers, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but unable to name exactly what. The city held its breath, poised on the edge of transformation, while two lovers who had never met prepared for a reunion that would symbolize not just their personal triumph, but the healing of an entire wounded world. As dawn approached on November 9, 1989, Wilhelm and Elena each stood at their respective sides of the wall, drawn by intuition or destiny to the barrier that had both separated and connected them for nearly 3 decades. The same stars that had witnessed their first letters continued to shine above Berlin, now ready to illuminate the greatest love story reunion in modern history. The wall that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, was about to crumble before the irresistible force of human longing for connection and freedom. November 9, 1989, dawned gray and cold in Berlin, with low clouds hanging over the city like a heavy blanket waiting to be thrown back. For 28 years, the wall had stood as an immutable fact of life, dividing not just a city but an entire world into competing ideologies, separated families, and broken dreams. But on this morning, currents of change that had been building for months were about to converge into a moment that would reshape the map of Europe and fulfill the deepest hopes of millions of separated hearts. Wilhelm rose early, as had become his habit over the years, and prepared for what he assumed would be another ordinary day at the library. At 52, he had learned to find contentment in routine, though his heart still quickened whenever he received one of Elena's letters. Their correspondence had continued without interruption for 25 years, creating a love story that existed almost entirely in the realm of words and imagination, sustained by faith and nurtured by hope that had never been extinguished despite decades of disappointment. Elena, now 50, began her day by tending to the small garden outside her apartment, a ritual that had grounded her through years of political uncertainty and personal longing. The flowers she grew had provided pressed specimens for hundreds of letters to Wilhelm, each bloom a small messenger carrying love across the concrete divide. As she worked among her plants in the early morning light, she could not have known that by sunset, the wall that had defined her entire adult life would be nothing more than a pile of concrete rubble and a monument to humanity's capacity for both division and reunion. The day's historic events began with a bureaucratic mistake that would accidentally trigger the most joyful revolution in modern European history. During a televised press conference, East German official Günther Schabowski announced new travel regulations that were supposed to go into effect the following day. But when pressed by journalists about the timing, he mistakenly said the changes would begin immediately. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners had gathered at the wall's crossing points, demanding passage to the west based on the officials' inadvertent promise of immediate freedom. Wilhelm was working quietly at his desk when a colleague burst into the library with news that crowds were gathering at Checkpoint Charlie. "Something's happening at the wall," the younger librarian gasped, his face flushed with excitement and disbelief. "People are saying the border guards might let them through. Wilhelm, after all these years, it might actually be happening." Wilhelm's heart began to race as he absorbed this news. 25 years of patient hope suddenly crystallizing into the possibility of immediate fulfillment. Elena learned of the developing situation from her students, who had heard rumors from parents and neighbors about masses of people heading toward the border crossings. Teacher Elena, one of her brightest pupils, asked, "Is it true that people might be allowed to visit the West tonight?" Elena's hands trembled as she tried to maintain her composure, explaining that sometimes rumors spread faster than facts, but in her heart, she felt the same electric anticipation that was building throughout the city. Could it be that their impossible dream was about to become reality? By early evening, the situation at the wall had reached a critical mass that no amount of official hesitation could control. Thousands of East Berliners pressed against the barriers, demanding passage based on the confusing but seemingly official announcement they had heard on television. Border guards, receiving no clear instructions from their superiors and faced with crowds that grew larger and more determined by the hour, found themselves in an impossible situation that would require a decision between violence and surrender. Wilhelm abandoned his library responsibilities and made his way through crowds of West Berliners who had gathered on their side of the wall to witness whatever was about to unfold. He had walked to the wall thousands of times over the years, but never with the sense of anticipation that filled him now. As he approached Checkpoint Charlie, he could see the massive crowds on the eastern side pressing against the barriers, their voices rising in a chorus of demand and hope that seemed to make the very concrete of the wall vibrate with possibility. Elena, meanwhile, had joined the growing crowd of East Berliners at the Brandenburg Gate crossing. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, she stood within meters of the Forbidden West, separated only by guards who looked increasingly uncertain and barriers that seemed less solid than they had just hours before. Around her, families held each other tightly, young people chanted slogans of freedom, and elderly couples who had been separated for decades whispered prayers that their long wait might finally be ending. At approximately 10:45 p.m., faced with crowds that had grown too large and determined to control, the border guards at several crossing points made the decision that changed history. Without official authorization, but with no alternative that didn't involve massive bloodshed, they opened the barriers and allowed the first East Berliners to cross freely into West Berlin. The impossible had become reality. The wall that had seemed eternal had been breached not by armies or explosives, but by the simple human desire to be free and connected. The first East Berliners to cross were met with champagne, flowers, and embraces from West Berliners who had gathered to witness this historic moment. Television crews that had come to cover what seemed like another routine political protest found themselves documenting one of the most joyful and significant events of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall, symbol of division and oppression for nearly 3 decades, was falling not to military might, but to the irresistible force of human longing for unity and freedom. Wilhelm, swept along by the celebrating crowds, found himself at the very edge of the newly opened border. Through tears of joy and disbelief, he watched as stream after stream of East Berliners poured through the gap in the wall, their faces showing a mixture of euphoria, bewilderment, and profound relief. He held a sign he had hastily made with Elena's name, hoping against hope that somehow, in the chaos and jubilation of this historic night, he might find the woman he had loved through words alone for 25 years. Elena, carried forward by the crowd, found herself stepping through the barrier that had defined the boundaries of her world since she was 22 years old. The sensation of crossing into West Berlin was overwhelming. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer, possibilities infinite after a lifetime of careful constraint. She too carried a sign with Wilhelm's name, though she could barely see through her tears of joy, and the crowd was so dense and excited that finding any individual seemed impossible. For hours, the two lovers searched for each other in the celebrating crowds that filled the streets around the collapsed barriers. Wilhelm made his way from Checkpoint Charlie to the Brandenburg Gate and back again, holding his sign high and calling Elena's name above the din of celebration. Elena, overwhelmed by her first experience of West Berlin, but determined not to miss this miraculous opportunity, searched through crowd after crowd of revelers, her heart pounding with the possibility of finally meeting the man who had sustained her through decades of separation. As dawn approached on November 10, exhaustion began to temper the euphoria of the night's events. Many of the celebrating crowds had dispersed, leaving behind a city transformed, but a love story still unfulfilled. Wilhelm and Elena, each unaware of how close they had come to encountering each other in the chaos of liberation, made their way home with hearts full of joy for their city's reunification, but aching with the realization that their personal reunion remained elusive. But the fall of the wall had created new possibilities that would soon bear fruit. Within days, the bureaucratic barriers that had prevented their official meeting began to crumble along with the physical ones. Wilhelm was able to obtain permits to enter East Berlin legally, while Elena found herself free to travel throughout the city for the first time in her adult life. Their network of letter carriers, no longer needed for clandestine communication, became instead a support system for planning the meeting that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Father Müller, now in his 80s but still active in their lives, suggested that their first meeting take place at his church, a neutral ground that had sheltered their correspondence for so many years. "After 25 years of bringing your letters together," he told them in separate conversations, "it seems fitting that I should bring your hearts together as well." Both Wilhelm and Elena agreed immediately, understanding the symbolic appropriateness of meeting in the place that had made their love story possible. The meeting was arranged for December 1, 1989, exactly 3 weeks after the fall of the wall. Wilhelm spent the intervening weeks in a state of nervous anticipation, rereading Elena's letters, trying to prepare himself for the reality of encountering the woman he had loved so completely in imagination. Elena experienced similar emotions, alternating between excitement and terror as she contemplated meeting the man who knew her heart more completely than anyone else in the world but had never seen her face. On the appointed day, both arrived at Father Muller's church early, each too nervous to risk being late for the most important meeting of their lives. Wilhelm wore his best suit and carried a bouquet of roses, traditional gestures that seemed inadequate for such an extraordinary occasion. Elena had chosen a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried a leather portfolio containing every letter Wilhelm had ever sent her, physical proof of their 25-year love affair. Father Müller greeted them separately, offering words of encouragement and blessing before leading them to the small chapel where their meeting would take place. "Remember," he told each of them individually, "you already know each other better than most couples who have been married for decades. This is not a first meeting but a reunion, not a beginning but a continuation of something beautiful you have already built together." When Wilhelm first saw Elena entering the chapel, his heart stopped for a moment before beginning to beat with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with hers. She was exactly as he had imagined, and completely different, more real and more beautiful than any fantasy could have conjured. Her eyes, which had been described in hundreds of letters, seemed to hold all the depth and warmth he had sensed in her words, while her smile carried the gentleness and wisdom that had sustained him through decades of separation. Elena's first sight of Wilhelm filled her with a recognition so deep it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. His face showed the kindness and intelligence she had known through his letters, while his eyes held the same steady love that had reached across concrete barriers and political divisions to touch her heart. He was both the stranger she was meeting for the first time and the soulmate she had known intimately for 25 years, a paradox that seemed perfectly natural in the miraculous context of their reunion. They approached each other slowly, as if sudden movements might break the spell that had finally brought them together. Wilhelm spoke first, his voice trembling with emotion. "Elena, after all these years of words, I find myself speechless." She smiled through tears that had begun to flow freely and replied, "Wilhelm, we have already said everything that matters in our letters. Now we can simply be together." Their first embrace lasted for several minutes, 25 years of longing and love compressed into a moment of perfect connection. They held each other as if they were afraid the other might disappear, as if the wall might suddenly rise again to separate them, as if the miracle of their reunion might prove to be nothing more than another beautiful dream. But gradually, as the reality of their meeting settled into their hearts, they relaxed into the joy of finally being together in the same physical space. Father Müller, watching from a respectful distance, wiped tears from his own eyes as he witnessed the fulfillment of a love story he had helped nurture for over 2 decades. "In all my years of ministry," he would later tell friends, "I have never seen such perfect happiness as when Wilhelm and Elena finally met. It was as if 2 halves of the same soul had been reunited after a lifetime of separation." They spent their first day together walking through the newly unified Berlin, visiting places each had described in letters, but the other had never seen. Wilhelm showed Elena his library, where she met colleagues who had heard about their correspondence for years. Elena took Wilhelm to her classroom, introducing him to students who had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious librarian in West Berlin who wrote such beautiful letters. Every location became sacred as they overlaid their years of imagination with the reality of shared experience. Their conversation flowed as naturally as their letters had, moving seamlessly between profound philosophical discussions and intimate personal revelations. They discovered that their physical chemistry was as strong as the intellectual and emotional connection they had built through correspondence. Wilhelm marveled at the way Elena's face lit up when she laughed, while Elena was enchanted by the gentle way Wilhelm moved his hands when he spoke, gestures that had been invisible through letters but now added new dimensions to his familiar words. As the weeks following their first meeting unfolded, Wilhelm and Elena experienced the strange joy of getting to know someone they already knew completely. They had already shared their deepest thoughts, their greatest fears, their most cherished dreams through 25 years of letters. Now they were learning the smaller intimacies of daily life, how Elena hummed while cooking, how Wilhelm's face looked when he was deep in thought, the way they both instinctively reached for each other's hands when walking down the street. The reunification of Berlin proceeded rapidly through the winter and spring of 1990, with bureaucratic barriers disappearing almost as quickly as the physical wall had fallen. Wilhelm and Elena found themselves caught up in the larger celebration of their city's healing, their personal reunion becoming part of the broader story of families, friends, and lovers who were reconnecting after decades of forced separation. They were interviewed by journalists who were fascinated by their 25-year correspondence, making them inadvertent symbols of hope and persistence in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. Their wedding, held in Father Muller's church on June 21, 1990, the summer solstice and the longest day of the year, was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Former students of Elena's sat next to regular patrons of Wilhelm's library, while members of their letter-carrying network filled the pews alongside family members who had been separated for decades but were now reunited thanks to the fall of the wall. The ceremony was conducted in both German and the universal language of love that had sustained Wilhelm and Elena through their years of separation. In his wedding vows, Wilhelm said, "Elena, you taught me that love is not about possession but about connection, not about proximity but about understanding. Through 25 years of letters, we built something more solid than any wall, more lasting than any political system. Today I promise not to love you differently, but to love you completely, with the same faith and devotion that carried us through the years of separation." Elena's vows reflected similar depth and wisdom. "Wilhelm, our correspondence taught me that the most important boundaries exist not in the world around us, but in our own willingness to reach across differences and divisions. You showed me that love is an act of faith, a daily choice to believe in something beautiful even when it seems impossible. I promise to continue choosing love, choosing hope, choosing us for all the days of our lives." Their honeymoon was spent traveling throughout the newly reunified Germany, visiting places they had written about but never seen together. They stood at the Brandenburg Gate, now open to all, and read aloud from their earliest letters, marveling at how the impossible dreams they had shared in writing had become the lived reality of their present. They visited the remains of the Berlin Wall, now being torn down systematically, and collected pieces of concrete as mementos of the barrier that had both separated and united them. As they settled into married life, Wilhelm and Elena discovered that their years of correspondence had prepared them remarkably well for the intimacies and challenges of living together. They had already learned each other's rhythms, preferences, and perspectives through their letters, so the adjustments of shared domestic life were minimal. Their home became a sanctuary filled with books, letters, and memories of their extraordinary courtship, visited regularly by friends who found inspiration in their story of patient love rewarded. Elena moved into Wilhelm's apartment in West Berlin, though they maintained her small place in the East as a studio and retreat. She found work teaching at a school that served students from both sides of the formerly divided city, using her experience to help children navigate the complexities of reunification. Wilhelm continued his work at the library while also beginning to organize their letters into a book that would preserve their story for future generations who might need reminders of love's power to transcend any barrier. Their first years of marriage were filled with the joy of simple domestic pleasures that had been denied them during their long separation. Cooking meals together, reading aloud in the evenings, tending Elena's expanded garden, welcoming friends for dinner, these ordinary activities carried extraordinary meaning for two people who had dreamed of them for 25 years. They often remarked that they had learned to treasure what many couples took for granted, finding profound happiness in the mere fact of being able to share physical space. As the first anniversary of the wall's fall approached, Wilhelm and Elena were invited to participate in the official celebrations, their story having captured the imagination of people around the world. They stood together at the Brandenburg Gate, surrounded by thousands of other people whose lives had been transformed by the events of November 9, 1989. In interviews, they spoke about how their personal love story had been intertwined with the larger story of their city's division and reunification, how private hope had sustained them until public celebration became possible. 2.0 Wilhelm's reflections on their first year of marriage revealed the wisdom gained through their extraordinary experience. Elena and I learned that love is not diminished by obstacles, but strengthened by them. Our 25 years of separation taught us to value every moment we have together, to never take connection for granted, to find joy in the simplest shared experiences. The wall that seemed like our enemy was actually our teacher, showing us what love could become when it was tested by the ultimate challenge. Elena's perspective complemented his beautifully. Our story shows that some forms of love are so powerful that they can survive anything: distance, time, political oppression, even the doubt that comes from never being certain that reunion is possible. We learned to love with faith instead of sight, to trust in connection despite separation, to build something beautiful from nothing more than words and hope. Now that we can touch each other's faces and share the same bed, our love feels both completely familiar and miraculously new. As the 1990s progressed, Wilhelm and Elena became elder statesmen of reunified Berlin, their apartment a gathering place for young couples facing their own challenges, historians studying the human impact of division, and visitors who came to hear their story of love triumphant over seemingly impossible odds. They never tired of telling their tale, understanding that it had become part of the larger narrative of hope and healing that defined their city's journey from division to unity. Their later years were filled with the contentment of people who had learned to appreciate the preciousness of time spent together. They traveled extensively, visited countries they had only dreamed of during their years of separation, and maintained correspondences with friends around the world who had been inspired by their story. But they always returned to Berlin, to the city that had shaped their love story and the home they had created from decades of patient faith. Wilhelm continued working at the library until he was 70, while Elena taught until she was 68, both finding that their work had been enriched by their unique perspective on the power of connection to transcend barriers. Their collection of letters was indeed published as a book that became a bestseller in Germany and was translated into dozens of languages, touching readers around the world who found hope in their example of love's persistence. The proceeds from the book were donated to organizations that helped reunite families separated by conflict, ensuring that their love story continued to build bridges long after their own reunion had been accomplished. As they entered their 80s, Wilhelm and Elena could look back on nearly 4 decades of marriage, 25 years of courtship through letters, and 15 years of shared daily life. Their love had not only survived but flourished, seasoned by time and strengthened by the knowledge of how precious and fragile human connection can be. They had become living proof that some forces are stronger than walls, that some bonds are more durable than concrete and steel, that some forms of love are so powerful that they can reshape the world around them. On quiet evenings in their Berlin apartment, surrounded by books and letters and memories of their extraordinary journey, Wilhelm and Elena would often read aloud from their early correspondence, marveling at the young people they had been and the faith that had sustained them through decades of separation. Their story had become legend, but to them it remained simply the natural expression of 2 hearts that had recognized each other across every barrier and chosen to build something beautiful together despite impossible odds. The Berlin Wall, which had once seemed like an eternal monument to human division, was now remembered primarily as a pile of rubble that had been transformed into art, monuments, and museums dedicated to the triumph of unity over separation. Wilhelm and Elena's love story had become part of that triumph, a reminder that walls are always temporary, but love, when it is patient and faithful and true, can be eternal. In their twilight years, they remained each other's greatest treasures, living proof that some things are worth waiting for, no matter how long the wait might be. And so the story of Wilhelm and Elena became part of the larger story of Berlin itself, a tale of division overcome, of barriers transcended, of hope rewarded by patience and faith. Their 25 years of letters had prepared them not just for their own reunion, but for their roles as symbols of what becomes possible when human love refuses to accept the boundaries imposed by politics and ideology. In the end, their love story was not just about 2 people finding each other across a wall, but about the power of the human heart to create connection wherever division has been imposed, to build bridges wherever barriers have been erected, and to prove that love is always stronger than fear, always more persistent than oppression, always more creative than the forces that seek to separate us from each other. As the stars that had watched over their first letters continued to shine above reunified Berlin, Wilhelm and Elena's love story became an eternal reminder that walls may rise and fall, but love endures forever. Their correspondence had become a monument more lasting than concrete, their patience a testament more powerful than politics, their reunion a proof that some dreams, when held with sufficient faith and tended with enough care, will always find a way to become reality. In a world that still builds walls between peoples and nations, their story remains a beacon of hope, whispering across the years that love will always find a way, that connection will always overcome separation, and that the human heart, when it loves truly and completely, can move mountains, topple walls, and transform the world. The children and grandchildren who came to visit Wilhelm and Elena in their later years would often ask them to tell the story of their letters, of their long wait, of the night the wall fell, and they finally found each other in the celebrating crowds. And they would tell it gladly, their voices soft with memory and rich with the wisdom that comes from having lived through history and emerged victorious on the side of love. They would speak of the importance of patience, of faith, of never giving up hope even when circumstances seem impossible. They would remind their listeners that the greatest victories are often won not through force but through persistence, not through anger but through love, not through tearing others down but through building bridges of understanding and connection. Wilhelm, in his final years, would often sit by the window of their apartment, looking out at the bustling streets of reunified Berlin, marveling at how the city had healed from its wounds and grown stronger from its scars. Young couples walked hand in hand through neighborhoods that had once been divided by barbed wire. Children played in parks that had once been no man's lands, and the energy of a united city flowed freely through streets that had known decades of artificial separation. "We were part of this healing," he would tell Elena, taking her hand in his weathered one. "Our love was one of the threads that held the city together, even when it was torn apart." Elena, her hair now silver, but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and warmth that had captivated Wilhelm through letters decades before, would nod and smile. "We proved that some things are stronger than walls," she would reply, her voice still carrying the gentleness that had made her beloved by generations of students. "We showed that love can wait, that faith can endure, that hope can survive anything." Our story became part of Berlin's story, and Berlin's story became part of the world's story about what happens when people refuse to accept division as permanent. On quiet evenings, when the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars beyond their windows, Wilhelm and Elena would sometimes take out the old wooden box where they kept their letters, hundreds of pieces of paper that chronicled 25 years of love sustained across an impossible divide. They would read random passages aloud to each other, sometimes laughing at their younger selves' earnestness, sometimes weeping at the pain and longing that permeated those years of separation, always marveling at the faith that had carried them through. "We wrote our love into existence," Elena would say, touching the yellowed pages with reverent fingers. "And then we lived it into reality." Their final years together were marked by the deep contentment of people who had been tested by life and emerged triumphant. They had learned that love is not just about finding the right person, but about choosing, day after day, year after year, to build something beautiful together despite obstacles and challenges. Their marriage, built on the foundation of 25 years of letters, proved to be stronger than marriages built on mere proximity or convenience. They had known each other's souls before they ever touched each other's hands, and that knowledge created a bond that neither time nor circumstance could weaken. Wilhelm passed away peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 2015 at the age of 78, with Elena holding his hand and sunlight streaming through their bedroom window. His last words were a whisper of gratitude. "Thank you for waiting for me, for believing in us, for proving that love can survive anything." Elena held him close as his breathing grew shallow and finally stopped, their hearts beating together one last time before his fell silent, while hers continued its solitary rhythm. Elena lived for 3 more years after Wilhelm's death, spending her final time organizing their letters and papers for donation to the Berlin Museum, ensuring that future generations would be able to learn from their story of patient love triumphant. She would sit in their apartment, surrounded by memories and mementos of their extraordinary life together, writing final additions to the memoir they had begun jointly in their 70s. Her last entry, written just days before her own peaceful death, read, "Our love story began with a wall and ended with freedom, started with separation and concluded with the deepest possible unity. We learned that the human heart recognizes no boundaries, that genuine love creates its own country where 2 souls can dwell together regardless of the barriers the world attempts to place between them. To those who read this in years to come, never give up hope. Never stop believing in love's power to transcend any obstacle. Never accept that division must be permanent. Walls fall, hearts unite, and love always finds a way." Elena died on a winter evening in 2018 at the age of 79, surrounded by friends, former students, and the countless people whose lives had been touched by her story with Wilhelm. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, including political leaders, historians, writers, and ordinary citizens who had found inspiration in the tale of 2 lovers who had proven that patience and faith could overcome any barrier. The service was held in Father Muller's old church, where Wilhelm and Elena had met for the first time and later exchanged wedding vows, bringing their story full circle to the place where it had found its earthly fulfillment. Their letters, now housed in the Berlin Museum's permanent collection, continue to inspire visitors from around the world who come to read the handwritten testimony to love's endurance. School children on field trips pause before the display cases containing Wilhelm and Elena's correspondence, learning about a time when their city was divided and about two people who refused to let that division define the boundaries of their hearts. Young couples facing long-distance relationships find hope in the example of two lovers who waited 25 years for their first embrace, while older visitors remember the Berlin Wall and marvel at the transformation that love and time can bring to even the most seemingly permanent barriers. The apartment where Wilhelm and Elena spent their married years has been preserved as a small museum and memorial, its rooms still filled with their books, their furniture, their plants, and the tangible evidence of a love that outlasted one of history's most notorious symbols of division. Visitors can sit at the desk where Wilhelm wrote his letters, walk through the garden where Elena grew the flowers she pressed between the pages of her correspondence, and stand at the window from which both lovers could see the place where the Berlin Wall once stood. The apartment serves as a pilgrimage site for those who believe in love's power to overcome any obstacle, a shrine to the possibility that faith and patience can ultimately triumph over fear and division. In the years since Elena's death, their story has been adapted into books, films, and operas, each artistic interpretation finding new ways to celebrate the themes of love, patience, hope, and the ultimate triumph of human connection over artificial barriers. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Wilhelm and Elena is not found in any museum or artwork, but in the living testimony of the couples they inspired, the long-distance relationships that endured because of their example, the marriages that survived difficult times because of the wisdom they shared, the people who chose love over fear because they had learned from two lovers who proved that anything is possible when hearts refuse to accept the boundaries imposed by circumstances beyond their control. Today, visitors to Berlin can walk freely through streets that were once divided, can cross easily between neighborhoods that were once separated by barbed wire and concrete, can take for granted the freedom of movement that Wilhelm and Elena dreamed of for 25 years. The physical traces of the Berlin Wall are mostly gone now, reduced to a few preserved sections and a line of cobblestones marking where the barrier once stood. But the story of Wilhelm and Elena endures, a reminder that some forms of love are so powerful that they can outlast any wall, overcome any obstacle, and inspire hope in every generation that discovers their tale of patient faith rewarded by impossible joy. And so the story ends where it began, with two hearts that recognized each other across an impossible divide and chose to love despite every barrier placed between them. Their correspondence became a bridge, stronger than any wall, their patience a testimony more enduring than concrete, their reunion a proof that love, when it is true and faithful and persistent, can indeed conquer all. In a world that continues to build walls between people and nations, the love story of Wilhelm and Elena stands as eternal proof that the human heart knows no boundaries, that genuine connection can survive any test, and that love will always, eventually, find a way to bring together what artificial forces have tried to keep apart. Sleep now, dear listeners, and dream of love that transcends all boundaries, of patience that outlasts all obstacles, of hope that transforms impossibility into reality. Let the gentle story of Wilhelm and Elena carry you into peaceful slumber, knowing that somewhere in the world, love is always finding a way to triumph over division. Hearts are always learning to beat in harmony across any distance, and walls are always, eventually, falling before the unstoppable force of human connection. Rest well, and may your dreams be filled with the knowledge that love, when it is true and patient and faithful, can indeed conquer all.